It's good to have you back. Now, we continue with our focus on child safety. NGO Afrika Tikkun says hungry children lead to jobless adults. It believes development begins in the cradle and continues into careers. Let's discuss this now with the organization's Alef Meulenberg. Alef, good morning to you and thank you so much for your time. Let's talk about, I suppose, in marking Child Protection Week, some of the challenges, the tragic challenges that young children have to face. I mean, for the mere fact that children are not assured safety in this country, I think it's quite a tragedy, because children do deserve that safety from elders. But we couple that with violence against children. How much of a gap does that leave into their development so they can thrive?
Morning, Tumelo, and thank you for having me on the show. I think it leaves a significant gap, and what kind of our output is to say, what will South Africa looks like in 20 years when these kids grow up? And it takes about 20 years to really turn around a country from being a poor or middle income country to a prosperous country. And that's, I think, what we all strive for South Africa. So not having a safe environment for children leaves a lot to be wanted, in the sense that if a child doesn't have a safe environment at home, doesn't have a safe environment in the community, or a safe environment at school, then learning will be impacted, and stunting will most likely happen in a child's life, being either intellectually or physically or emotionally. And normally what happens in the future is that a child then has less opportunities when it comes to being employed or starting a business and being self-employed.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the point around intellectually and emotionally, because oftentimes when we speak about protection, it's easy to think about just the physical aspect. Let's get into that then. What psychological effects does violence and all other forms of child abuse do to a child's development? I mean, psychologically at school, in terms of their learning, their development, how they socialize with other people, society. Where are the dangers there?
So if a child doesn't feel safe, and I'm by no means a psychologist, but I do know that when a child doesn't feel safe, learning is not the main priority of the child. Self-preservation actually is, both from an emotional and a physical point of view. So a child will withdraw or will show signs of extreme behavior, in the sense that it will want attention. If the abuse is neglect instead of like verbal abuse or physical abuse. So it will impact a child's life significantly, and it will impact a child's learning significantly. And as an organization that stands pretty much for education and skills development, for us that is huge, because if a child is educated properly through early childhood development all the way to like a career development, skills development course or university, then the outputs are normally employment, self-employment, and essentially a positive output to society. If that's not the case, then often the opposite is true.
Yeah, there are also some staggering, statistics here that I think, it's quite important to also highlight, Alef. I could go on and on around, the numbers just in terms of children killed. 392 children were killed in a span of 90 days in 2021 alone. There's stats around over 2,000 children who are victims of physical assault. But also another staggering, reality that I think is important to highlight is the number of child-headed households, particularly affecting and impacting on young girls. And I just wonder how that affects their development, given that they have to grow up at such a young age, have this huge responsibility of cleaning, cooking, taking care of other children, the household, and then neglecting their childhood and childlike, characteristics. I just wonder what are the consequences of that? Are they negative? Are they positive?
I think they can be both. What I do know is that it limits their opportunities, doesn't it? Because they have the responsibility, as you rightly say, in order to take care of a family, while they should be looking at taking care of their own studies, or taking care of their own, growing their own interests in particular fields, so that they can be excellent in that field. So it definitely impacts them. It does lead to a high level of maturity, but it can also lead to a high level of bitterness, of like you said, losing out on the childhood. And I think, on the other hand, listening to those stats, we have become quite desensitized to violence in South Africa in particular, because it's become so normal. We've heard those stats over and over again. And I really think it's time for us to look inwardly and actually say, how angry do we get, or how upset do we get that these things are still happening today, and what are we going to do about it?
Now, Alef, what do we do then as society? Sure, we can say, government can play a role, social development can come into play, social workers can obviously, do what they're assigned to do in terms of protecting children. But if I'm a neighbor, if I'm a relative, if I'm a friend, if I'm someone who's observing what's happening to innocent children, what is it that I can do? What role can I play?
Be brave. And I think and it's almost like that Ubuntu spirit, I am because we are. It comes back here again as well, is if you observe negative behavior against children, both physically or from a verbal point of view, speak out to the neighbor. And if the neighbor is not willing to listen, then go to the relative authorities, whether that is an NGO like ourselves, and we often get cases where there's child abuse involved or where there's that reported, and then we start looking into it through social workers and occupational therapists and the like, or go to, if there's actual real physical violence, then go to the police.
Well, I appreciate you speaking to us about this. CEO of Afrika Tikkun, Alef Meulenberg, such a pleasure talking to you about this, placing the spotlight on the importance of child protection so that, of course, that could give them better rates at development and thriving. That's Alef Meulenberg.